Hi, I'm Professor Catherine Loveday. I'm a neuropsychologist at the University of Westminster and also a trustee for AgeUK Barnet. This short video today is for people who are supporting loved ones who may have dementia or memory problems. And what we wanted to do was to think about some of the ways during the COVID crisis that we may want to give additional support, or really just to help people think about what might they be able to do to try and deal with the current circumstances. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is routine. This is particularly important right now because we just don't have the same reference points that we normally have. Our days are much more similar. We're not going outside, so there's no change in our context. So most of our conversations are basically happening in the same kind of space. Now that's kind of causing problems for all of us, but it makes it particularly difficult for those people who have memory problems. There are other reasons why routine is particularly important right now. There's a lot more anxiety and uncertainty around. And when you have a sense that some things are predictable, then that can make people feel a bit more comfortable. And also there may be some situations where it's more difficult for you to visit the person that you would normally support, or there is just less human contact, and we may be relying on people to be a little bit more independent with things like medication and so on. Anything that comes at a regular time every day will happen through habit. It really is true that old habits die hard. So routine is really important for those really kind of necessary behaviours like medication and eating, but it also has a lot of other benefits. So it's very good for our sleeping patterns. Sleep is quite dependent on brain rhythms, which get disrupted in dementia. And so one of the things that we can do to encourage regular sleeping is to have very regular routines, and that really helps. And sleep is important for physical health, but also for psychological health and for memory. So by having a good routine, then sleep can also be supported. The question is, what can we do to improve that routine? We all know it's important, but what can we actually do? So one of the things is to try and have really fixed things in the day. Now, I appreciate this is going to be very different if you're living with somebody compared to if you're living a long way from somebody or not able to actually be with them much of the time. But there are lots of ways in which we can try and make sure these anchor points are in place. So things like watching regular TV programs, news programs and so on, making sure that meal times are as regular as possible. Those kind of things are important. If you're living with somebody, then trying to maintain that routine is very useful and important. If you're not living with the person, then there are still things that you can do. So you could potentially make sure that you always make the phone call at the same predictable time every day, or on certain days of the week. Or you could try calling at a time that you know is important. So maybe just before a particular TV program that you know the person might want to watch. And then you can kind of encourage them to maybe watch that TV program. So there are things that you can do even from a distance to try and encourage those anchor points. And the same thing might be true for a week. So, for example, if a person has any regular weekly commitment, then trying to encourage some way that thing still happens on that day of the week. If, for example, they've always gone to church on a Sunday or to another kind of religious service, then trying to replace that with something that is similar so that there is still the sense that it's that day of the week. That can be really helpful. Also, really basic things like calendars, and there are some really fantastic clocks now that have the time and day on them and even say what time of day it is. So it'll say 6 p.m. in the evening on whatever date and day it is. So those can be really, really helpful as well. But having calendars, some people like to have a diary that's open, and then again, if you're from a distance, you can call and you can ask the person to check the diary on that day, take them to the right day of the diary, and so on. So anything you can do to try and anchor those points and keep a routine fixed and help people to have some kind of sense of where they are in the day and in the week, and sometimes even in the year. The second thing that I think is being particularly impacted by the current circumstance, but which is really important, is social connection. Now, we all know that we're very dependent. All of us are dependent on being connected to other people. We're very social creatures. We know that loneliness is not particularly good for us. Now, again, if you're living with somebody and you're living away from them, these things can be very, very different. But the challenges are still there. So if you're living away from somebody and you're feeling a bit lost as to how can I connect with that person, I guess the first thing to say is, for most people, the phone is really good. It's something that people are used to using. It's familiar technology, and the human voice is incredibly soothing and powerful and a very strong way of connecting with people. There's been some really nice studies that have shown that when you look at brain activity, when you hear a human voice, it can actually trigger some of the same activity in the brain as having a hug and being touched by that person. So the human voice can be really powerful. I think you can try out different things. For some people, we've seen that things like Skype, where there is a sort of face as well, can be helpful. Some people manage the technology better than you expect them to. Some people really struggle with it and are very uncomfortable and find it too overpowering. So it's a trial and error type thing, but finding some way of having that connection. And also maybe sending emails if the person is able to connect to an email or to read your emails, because the written word is something that can be gone through a bit more slowly and someone can take their time to read what things say. I think where you are using things like emails or the written word, trying to not make sentences overly long can be really helpful, because you're not putting too much cognitive load on the person then. And I know some people are still really enjoying writing letters or sending pictures from their children, and different people have opinions on whether that's okay at the current time. But if you are somebody that feels comfortable with that, again, it's very nice to receive something in the post. So in terms of what you might actually talk to somebody about, I guess where possible, it's really great to let the person lead the conversation, and don't be afraid of going where they're comfortable going, because what matters is that sense that they're being listened to and that there's some connection. Sometimes, though, you might get very little reaction, or a person is not feeling like they want to speak very much. So in those situations, maybe just kind of telling a story, talking about something that you've been doing, or maybe asking questions about something that you know is an easy question for them to answer, something that they can observe out of the window, for example, about the weather or how the garden's looking. Or talking about something that is in the past, something, again, that you have spoken to them lots about before and you know that they're comfortable chatting about. What is important is that sense of connection. The topic's almost irrelevant a lot of the time. It's just somebody feeling that they're connecting with somebody. There are some really important additional tips. If you're talking on the phone, then sometimes it's really important to just slow your speech down a tiny bit, but also to take pauses, to allow a person time to kind of process what you're saying. If you're speaking at 100 miles an hour because you're really busy, for example, then often that can just feel a bit overwhelming and a person kind of disengages. So taking your time to speak, but that doesn't mean being patronising. There's a lot of research on something called elder speak, which is this tendency to speak down to people, and that's not particularly helpful, and people don't like it very much. Another important thing is to not correct people unless it's absolutely necessary, unless this is a factual thing that has an impact, like someone's medication or something that really has an important health impact. It's not necessarily important whether the thing that they're talking about is absolutely factually correct or not. As I say, if it's important for it to be factually correct, or something, a misunderstanding that you really need to try and adjust, then you can do that in a gentle way, through kind of essentially repeating the alternative message, the message that you want to get across, in different ways throughout the conversation. One of the things we know about the memory system is that fundamentally repetition is really, really important. And even for somebody with quite a lot of memory loss, they will take something on board if it's said to them enough times, usually in as many different ways as you can. But if somebody is telling you something happened that didn't happen and it doesn't really matter, then just let it go. And bear in mind that any form of connection is useful. There's a limit to what you personally can do. Any one of us, there's a limit to what we can do. So it doesn't have to be you. getting other people to make that phone call, or simply just getting them to engage with the radio or listening to their favourite music, or humour's really good as well. Anything where there is the sense of there being another person and sort of more humanity around them, that can be really helpful. One of the more specific questions is how to speak about COVID, how to speak about this current crisis. Again, I think it's important to let the other person lead, let the questions come from them, and just keep the messages simple. You don't need to go into lots of complex detail, because that can just feel overwhelming. There's actually some really good resources out there that are aimed at children, and actually I found that even for myself, sometimes those really simplistic overviews can be much more helpful, and they're a useful way to make sure that the basics are there. And of course, any messages that are important, like hand washing and staying safe and staying inside, those kind of things are messages that are important to get across, and you do that simply through sort of repetition. And I think the other thing is to look for positives. A lot of people are not going to hang on to much of your conversation, but if you are repeatedly sort of talking about some of the positive sides of things that are going on, then even after the person has left that conversation, they're still left with a sense of something positive. I think a really good analogy is like when you've had a dream. And for many people with dementia, a conversation is like a dream. It's just kind of almost gone within seconds of it finishing, but you're still left with the feeling of what came from that conversation. So just because somebody doesn't remember a conversation that you've had with them or any of the detail, don't feel that it hasn't been important, because it is. It really does impact on the way that somebody's feeling, and it impacts on their mental and physical health when you're doing that. And then finally, so we've talked about routine, we've talked about social connection. I think the other thing is just looking for ways that you can offer psychological and practical support for somebody. So of course, the number one thing at the moment has to be around safety, your safety, their safety. And that means, unfortunately, minimising the amount of physical contact you can have. But there are things that are really important. Regular good meals are important. So nutrition, we know, makes a difference to the way someone's functioning and how their brain is. So along with the routine and the sleep, nutrition, medication, those are really fundamental things that are really going to impact on somebody's state of health. So doing what you can to make sure those things are in place is really important. Beyond that, there's some fantastic examples of activities actually on the Alzheimer's website. They've got some great suggestions of activities. But essentially you can kind of divide these into two things. So things that are really present and engaging, something that a person can do that doesn't require memory, doesn't require any huge cognitive skill, but just is something that someone can immerse themselves in. And that may be something as simple as listening to a piece of music or colouring something in, or knitting. Sometimes people enjoy knitting or embroidery, something that they've done a lot of and is very automatic. For some people, things like jigsaws or simple card games. And again, it depends on the person's level of memory loss. But for some people, really quite complex things like Sudoku and crosswords are still possible, and they're really good ways to just immerse the person in the present, which takes them away from that sense of anxiety and uncertainness about the current circumstances. The other thing that's a really sort of safe place to go is the past. And people sometimes are a bit worried about there being too much reminiscence and nostalgia in case it has a negative impact. But actually, we know that by and large, nostalgia and reminiscence is very good for all of us. So music, again, very powerful, and there's lots of fantastic resources now for people to connect with music. But using either as a talking point or as something that somebody can engage with, music, photos, even kind of important objects and items of clothing, we found that all of these things can be really good triggers for conversations and feelings and thoughts about the past. Another thing, again, depending on how much of a memory impairment that the person has, you can sometimes encourage writing. So we've got a couple of people we're working with at the moment who are writing parts of their life story down. It's not necessarily always going to be absolutely correct or in the right order, but actually that act of writing has been really beneficial and helpful, as well as actually very, very interesting. Another couple of things that are important where possible is, one of the things is that people are not getting out and about, so they're not doing as much movement, and actually physical exercise is quite important. So being creative about ways of getting people moving. Again, there's some fantastic options for online things if you're living with somebody that you can kind of set them up with. But even somebody kind of dancing around their home, something that kind of makes people feel that they want to move around, that can be quite good. We've talked about routine being very important in terms of people's psychological health, because it gives them a sense of what to expect. But I think also the really, really important thing is that if you want to support somebody else, then you absolutely must look after yourself. So for those that are maybe living at home with somebody and finding it quite tiring, maybe it's really important that you take that time out for yourself and that you give yourself that break. If you're someone that's living at a distance, the stress then can be the sense that you can't get to that person and that you're not doing enough. In those cases, you have to remember that what you're doing for that person is keeping them safe. And use as many of these other techniques and suggestions as you can to provide support and social connection with the person that you are caring about or that you are wanting to support. So I hope that's been useful for you. The 3 things, just to say them again, are routine. Really important to do everything you can to help people feel that there is a sense of routine. Secondly, ensuring that somebody has as much social connection as they sort of can do under the circumstances, and being creative about how you find that social connection. And thirdly, making sure that there is some sort of psychological and practical support in place, and looking for additional help outside where you need it so that you can keep yourself healthy and fit and well. Thank you very much for watching.